Okay, today we are going to begin working on a new project, and we are in week 5 in your syllabus. We are going to work on an ambitious still life with fruit and a bowl and drapery. So that's going to involve some more drawing than I would say we've been used to. So we're going to introduce some new drawing concepts such as ellipses and also working with drapery folds. So before I get into the drawing with the still life, which I've already started, I am going to just briefly go over those two things because those are pretty important aspects of the drawing. So let's get started. So an ellipse is a circle that's in perspective. So it changes to an oval shape depending on what point of view you are looking at it from. An example of an ellipse would be the top of your coffee cup. That's an ellipse, or the top of a soup can. And when you are looking at it straight on, it's a circle, but depending on your point of view, that ellipse changes depending on where you're sitting or standing in relationship to that object. So I'm just going to demonstrate how to do an ellipse on a coffee cup. Great, so I've started this coffee cup, and it's a rectangular shape, and it has 2 ellipses in it. It has one on the bottom, and it's an ovular shape, so the bottom is going to be rounded. So that's the inside of the ellipse you can't see. And at the top, step aside here, is another ellipse, and it's an oval shape. So to get that nice symmetrical shape, what you need to do is draw some crosshairs with your ruler. You want to try to find the center of your ellipse, and then you can draw a straight line through that center. One way you could do that would be to try to measure, I think it's about 2.5 inches. Or you could just try to eyeball it, which is what I did. I just tried to figure out where the center was. Just make sure they're both equal. That's pretty much how you can tell you're in the center, is that the top and the bottom are equal. So that's what you want to look for. And then your edges of the ellipse should meet on this line. Okay. So that goes to that edge, and then this one under here goes like so. So you want to double check and make sure that the top and the bottom are the same measurement, and that's how you'll know you have a symmetrical ellipse. So that's very important. And if you feel uncomfortable, you could just start drawing some little ovular shapes just to get familiar. And try to make your own ellipse, before you get into that. And these are called studies. So I'll try to make one from scratch. Okay, so this one is not symmetrical. So I'm going to need to bring this down and compare it to the one up above. Try to try to keep measuring and checking with your crosshairs. You can also measure this way just to make sure your length is the same on both sides. Okay? And you also want to be sure it is not flat at the top or the bottom. It's always rounded, the top and the bottom. So let's move on to the folds that you're going to find in your drawing demonstration. The closest fold I could find is something called a diaper fold, and it looks like maybe they've draped a piece of fabric on the wall, and it creates these rounded types of folds. So here in your drawing, you know, you have that drape down there, and then you've got like a bit of shadow in there. So that is what a fold is like. So that one's going to be a little bit more difficult, and you're just going to need to look at your reference to judge your proportions as regards to that. That's going to be a little bit more challenging. So let's get into that. So I've got a drawing started already. And in your book it says to start with this yellow ochre color, but I would recommend, you know, use whatever you have. But if you have yellow ochre, then go for that. Just make sure that that is darker than the color you've got. So I have blue paper, and that's what I'm going to use. So I'm going to use a white chalk so that I can be sure that I can see the color. So it's a good idea to have a ruler with you when you go to do your ellipse. So let's get started with that. Alright. So I'm going to draw my center line. I'm going to draw my vertical line. And I'm going to measure, okay, with my ruler. Make sure, you know, maybe get an idea of, if I want to be real technical, how wide that is. Okay. So I would start with the drawing of the bowl and the ellipse first. Get that right before you get into lots of detail. So I'm going to step aside, and I'm going to remeasure. Looks like maybe I need a little bit more up here at the top. Great. Right, so let's check that again. So I think that's closer. But again, it's going to be covered up with the fruit, so it doesn't have to be absolutely exact. Only other thing I'm going to do is measure my sides. So that's, you know, pretty close. So it's rounded here and rounded at the top. So let's move on to the rest of the bowl. So that is like, if you could imagine a circular, maybe like an orange where the top was cut off. You know, think about it that way. Just circular shape. And you can just go real light. And if you want to check for the symmetry, since this is a man-made object, you can draw something called a mirror. Draw it straight through the middle. And then, you know, just measure your sides just like you did with that wonderful ellipse that we just did. And that will help you keep that symmetrical. Just make sure your bottom is nice and rounded. So that looks good to me. So I'm going to just check the next step in the book. I'm going to start drawing the fruit in the bowl, figuring out where that is in relationship to the bowl. Let me tilt this a little bit. So I've already got some fruit started up here, and you can just start out with the basic shapes. You know, these are circles, maybe with a little cone added on top. And then down here, you have another apple. Try to figure out how big that is in relationship to the one that came before it. And you can always look at your reference, back and forth. Or you could set up your own bowl with fruit. Either way. So just try to get those shapes in there and don't worry about detail. Just try to find out how big they are and what the placement is. So now I'm moving on to another shape. I think it's a pear. A little bit more of an oval shape. And it's okay if your shapes overlap at this point. So there's a pear up here, and then we have a space, and then another lemon, maybe up here. So we've got that lemon shape, got a space. Then up here, it looks like there is another apple. So it's like another circular shape. And I might need to readjust my bowl just to make sure it follows, the demo. So that's what drawing is. Sometimes you have to make an adjustment to get a little more accurate. So now that I've changed that, I'm going to double check that measurement. So that's going to change the measurement of the ellipse on the other side too. So we'll take that into account and go ahead, make that adjustment. So I've extended that side as well as that side. Right. So we've got our shapes in. There's some shapes here in the foreground. I've got a lemon. I'm going to draw a pear. It's like it's tipped over a little. So maybe start with an oval shape and then, maybe a bit of a triangle. So don't worry about getting it perfect. You can always refine those shapes. So there's overlapping of the bowl and the pear. So we've got the lemon and the pear. So we've got all the fruit so far. Now we're going to move on to those difficult drapery folds. And I wish I could compare them to some shape that they would fit into, but they really don't. So it's more like following directions of lines. Like here we've got, maybe a bit of a vertical line. That's the fold that starts here. And then, I'm just looking at my drawing and I'm looking at how thick the folds are and is it a vertical line? And if it is, where is it going? You can just bring that all the way down there to the edge. So this helps establish where your table top is. And I didn't really go into the horizon line, but if I were going to draw one, I would put it, it's a pretty high horizon line. I put it somewhere up here. But you can't really see it because of the drapery. So then next drapery, there's a little bit of a shadow created by the drapery on the bowl. And just gonna keep trying to find those shapes of the drapery as best as I can. And they are all a little bit different. Okay. So there's that fold. Then we're going to come over here and maybe there's a bit of a fold here. And I'm also drawing in indications of where the shadows would be. These areas where I'm putting in some hatching, just to remind you those would be darker areas. When you get into more of the color. So we got a shadow there. Then we got another fold back here. And it has a bit of a shadow. And then from that fold, we have another fold that kind of goes in and out. So these don't have to be perfectly rendered. We just want the idea that there's fabric that's draped on a table, and it's just creating an interesting opportunity for some interesting shapes and some value shifts. And then back here we're just going to map in, that would be like the cast shadow from the fruit itself. Alright. And then, maybe, yeah. So that would be your initial drawing. So that's it for the drawing aspect for today.